So I want to start out with a question about just this targeting of OT by advanced persistent threat groups. Just are you seeing a strategic shift towards this kind of targeting? And if so, what do you attribute it to?
So there's always been nation state interest in understanding critical infrastructure associated with potential adversary nations. That's not new. The thing that's really changed to me is we've gone beyond reconnaissance and foreign actors trying to understand our critical infrastructures, if you will, its layout, its composition, its potential vulnerabilities, how it works.
Right.
You're seeing a shift. This is where Volt Typhoon is really interesting. You're seeing a shift on the extreme side represented by the Chinese, where they actually seem to have come to the decision that it's within the realm of acceptable risk to now actually in place destructive malware within that infrastructure. We had never seen that before. We had certainly seen nation states gaining access to critical infrastructure, but the assessment had been, hey, it's reconnaissance. They're trying to gain access to the network so they can understand it. They're trying to map it. They're trying to identify potential vulnerabilities. Now we seem to be moving to a stage where nation states actually want to take advantage of some of those vulnerabilities to actually place destructive capabilities.
Right.
That should be very worrisome to us.
So that kind of leads into my next question. It's just, for now anyway, before there's actual conflict, how much is this activity just a projection of power or an attempt to kind of sow some chaos as opposed to actually being destructive?
So it appears, at least my view, so you take it for what it's worth, my sense is that this appears to be a decision, at least in the case of the Chinese, that they want to be able to place things at risk. I don't think that their goal was, hey, let's create chaos, let's create destabilization. That may be the outcome if they actually execute it. At the moment, to me, it appears to be they've come to the decision, we need to actually place capabilities within the network structures that we can activate at the time and place of our choosing, and that would place at risk the ability of the operator to actually control and operate that infrastructure.
Is this all an outcome of maybe a lack of defined red lines in cyberspace? Are we still kind of in early days of that?
It's clearly an indicator that in some dimensions, at least, we aren't deterring adversaries. Now, on the other hand, we do need to step back and provide some context. Look, at the moment, this does not seem to be something broader beyond the Chinese. I'd highlight at the moment, because my view is, if one nation is willing to do this, you're going to watch others go down this same road. So, we'll be watching, the government, as well as the network owners, those that help defend them. You'll be watching the Chinese, you'll be watching the Russians, you'll be watching the Iranians, you'll be watching the North Koreans, and you'll be looking to see, are there any independent, non-state actors? So, for example, we've seen ransomware by criminals within the IT framework for years. You've started to see criminals on the ransomware side within the OT framework in the last couple of years. Do you see criminals start to go down this road? Either they do it themselves or they do it as a nation state asks them, hey, look, we nation state X want some measure of plausible deniability. Therefore, hey, we'd like you, non-state actor, criminal group, we'd like you to do some things for us, like potentially in place destructive malware.
Do you see it strategically on the part of some of the APTs to use ransomware as like cover for something deeper?
We've seen that a couple times where the ransomware didn't seem to be the really true focus of the activity. Haven't seen that broadly yet. Again, we're going to put things in context. We haven't seen that broadly yet. We have seen that in a couple of instances. That's an interesting trend to be paying attention to for the future. Hey, is that an indicator of things that dynamics are changing? But we're not there yet.
NotPetya comes to mind. It was basically that was a wiper attack under the guise of ransomware.
Right. Although NotPetya was, it's interesting. Arguably it's the largest global event we've had, at least by an APT. I would argue that what we just went through with CrowdStrike was the largest global event, and that was self-induced. So it does show you the nature of the cyber system these days.
What are some of the weaknesses in OT networks, industrial control systems, that you believe are most attractive to an APT, and which of these kind of particularly trouble you right now?
So number one, in many instances, not at all, in many instances, the level of security built into components within our OT structure is pretty low. Because when they were created, there wasn't much thought to, hey, might somebody actually attempt to penetrate, gain access for either manipulative or destructive purposes? That just wasn't a key thought when many of these components were being designed and built. So I worry a little bit that some of the basic components have a level of vulnerability that in today's world we would step back and say, hey, that's really high or really unacceptable. So we need to worry about that. We need to think about OT much more comprehensively than we had traditionally. We've tended to, in my experience, we've tended to view it largely through the prism of physical security and a little less through the implications of, network or cyber security. Sure. Now, clearly that's been changing over the course of the last couple of years in particular, but you still at times run into that, or at least I still encounter that at times where I'm struck by, wow, we need to look at this problem set more broadly. There are more than just physical dimensions to this.
And so some of these circumstances aren't necessarily new for OT, but what's your advice in terms of imparting some urgency around this now to security leaders? I mean, I know CIS is talking about secure by design a lot and initiatives like that. What's your take on that?
So look, the pressure, you're seeing greater regulatory pressure. You are seeing cyber insurance companies, look at what they are requiring now compared to, in terms of if you want coverage compared to where they were 2 years ago. Look at the regulatory pressures that are out there from the government in terms of, particularly if you are in OT associated with critical infrastructure. The government's talking about increased requirements in terms of basic level of cybersecurity, basic level of cyber hygiene, requirements to report that weren't there, 3 years ago.
Sure.
So you're seeing regulatory pressures. The thing that the organizations that impress me the most when I look at OT structures are those that, number one, look at it more broadly, as I said, than just the physical side. But I also like examples of organizations where the IT and the OT side are talking to each other. Now, it doesn't mean they all have to be in the same team, because there are some organizations that are going to this integrated, hey, let's put IT and OT together. I don't think the majority of organizations are there right now. My view is, look, as a minimum, we need a much greater dialogue, because I think each can learn from the other, because each has tended to look at their problem through a pretty distinct aperture historically. IT generally looked through it through the network side, through their problem set. OT generally looked at it from the physical side. My view is they can learn from each other and each make OT and IT cybersecurity stronger. And that's the objective here in the end.
Culture changes are hard.
Oh yeah. You're asking people to get out of their comfort zone.
Right.
You're asking people to reach out to others that they haven't worked with before, that they don't know, that have a very dissimilar background. It doesn't make them bad, it makes them pretty human.
Sure. So similar question, just jumping back to Volt Typhoon for a second. Some of their targeting included military bases, those kinds of installations. What should they be doing around this, in this context, just to improve their resilience? There's a lot of OT within these installations
Exactly.
as
So
well.
look, I would argue it doesn't matter if you're government or the private sector.
Yeah.
If you're responsible for the security dimensions of OT, particularly in critical infrastructure, but just in general, there's some things you need to be doing now that perhaps you wouldn't have considered a few years ago. That you can't sit there and say to yourself, well, they're only going to go after the grid. They're only going to go after the commercial kinds of things. They're not going to worry about military. That's clearly not the case. Likewise, you can't sit there and say, hey, I am a small power provider in the Midwest. They're not really going to be interested in me. They're interested in the massive power providers in the major urban areas, particularly along the coasts. I don't think you can take that approach either. It's just the world we're living in now. The attacker doesn't seem to be focused predominantly on sector or size. That just doesn't seem to be the driver at the moment.
These are really unique times, and I think CISOs are, unfortunately, and other security leaders are really caught in the middle.
There's a lot of pressure out there right now
Yeah.
in the security world. There is no doubt about it. But I would also highlight that's opportunity. Your corporate leadership has never been more aware of vulnerability. Your corporate leadership has never been more aware of growing risk. Those are all things that you can turn to advantage to work with your leadership to say, given that, hey, here's our strategy. This is what our focus should be. This is how we should align resources. This is how I need your help as a leader over and above me as the CISO, the CIO, or the OT segment leader. Hey, look, I can do a lot, but I can't do it all.
Sure.
And as the overall leader for an organization, CEO, board, on the business side, chief operating officer, you can do a lot to enhance security for our OT infrastructure, and I need you to help me with this.
Yeah. I know we've spoken about that in the past. It's
Yeah,
kind
yeah.
of just don't waste that opportunity.
Yeah, I was gonna
basically,
say, never let a
is the
good-
message.
never
what
let
are
a
some
good crisis
examples
go to
maybe
waste.
that from your career that you could share? Obviously,
For me, I remember the first time we had a major penetration. This is when I was a 3-star and I was running the Navy's. I was responsible as part of a team for the Navy's cybersecurity, for its networks, its data, to forestall opponents' ability to access. And despite our best efforts, the Iranians got into our continental United States shore-based network infrastructure, and it had not happened before. And in order, because this was a massive network, in order to make this work, we had to put some pretty aggressive tactics in place that had an impact on the user community on the network. And I'm talking to the leadership about, we need to do this, and here's why, and I need your help. I don't need the organization railing against, well, why are Rogers and his guys going through a password or identity review? Hey, why are they shutting down? Why are they segmenting network functionality? Why are they, increasing latency in some instances? And I sat there and told our team, this is how we're going to drive change in this organization, because we're about to show this organization just how important their network structure is, and how, if they'll work with us, we can enhance the security of that structure. And as a result of that, we outlined about 5 things where I told the leadership, remember those 5 things I've been talking to you about for the last 18 months?
right.
Here's why they're important, and we really need to accelerate this. And so as a result, got more money, more prioritization, greater retention. And we were able to also, personally as a leader, I also was very proud of the fact we were able to highlight to the leadership of the broader organization, in this case the United States Navy, the great men and women and their capabilities who were focused on cybersecurity and ensuring the protection of our networks, our data, and our OT infrastructure. I love that as a leader, that the people who don't work in this every day, they oftentimes take it for granted. They know these motivated men and women are there, but they don't necessarily see or have awareness of what they do.
Sure.
It's when you get in a crisis that they really, wow, that was great. We built so much credibility out of what could have been a terrible
Right.
event for us.